This is the story of Alexander the Great. He was a king, a soldier, and a conqueror. Before he was 33 years old, he had built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. He never lost a single battle. And then, at the height of his power, he suddenly died, and no one is completely sure why. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the dark story of Alexander the Great. Alexander was born more than 2,000 years ago in a land called Macedonia in the north of Greece. His father was a powerful king named Philip. His mother was a strong and mysterious queen named Olympias. From the very beginning, people felt that this boy was different. His mother even told him that he was not an ordinary child, that he came from the blood of gods and heroes. Alexander believed her, and that belief would drive him for his whole life. There is a famous story from when Alexander was just a boy. A trader brought a huge, wild horse to his father's court. The horse was beautiful, but it was so wild that no man could ride it. Everyone tried, and everyone failed. The king was ready to send the animal away. But young Alexander saw something the others did not. He saw that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. So he gently turned the horse toward the sun, so it could not see the shadow, and he calmly climbed on its back. The whole court went silent. His father, the king, had tears in his eyes, and he said, "My son, find a kingdom big enough for you, because Macedonia is too small." Alexander named the horse Bucephalus, and it carried him into battle for the rest of its life. To prepare his brilliant son, King Philip brought in the greatest teacher in the world, the philosopher Aristotle. For years, Aristotle taught Alexander about science, about politics, about courage, and about the stories of great heroes. Alexander especially loved the old tales of warriors, and he carried those stories in his heart, always dreaming of glory. Then, suddenly, everything changed. At a great celebration, King Philip was murdered, stabbed by one of his own guards. In an instant, Alexander was no longer just a prince. At only 20 years old, he was the king of Macedonia. And many people thought this young king would be weak and easy to control. They were very, very wrong. Some cities saw the young king and thought it was their chance to break free. They rebelled. Alexander answered with terrifying speed and force. He crushed the rebellion completely, and to send a message to the whole world, he destroyed one famous city almost entirely. The message was clear: do not test this young king. After that, no one in Greece dared to stand against him. But Greece was never Alexander's real dream. His eyes were already looking east, toward the greatest empire on earth. That empire was Persia. It was enormous, rich, and powerful, far bigger than anything Alexander ruled. It was led by a king named Darius, who commanded armies so large they seemed impossible to beat. And yet, with a much smaller army, Alexander crossed the sea and marched straight into Persian land. To his soldiers, it seemed like madness. To Alexander, it was his destiny. Along the way, he reached a city with a famous legend. There was an ancient knot tied so tightly and so cleverly that no one had ever been able to undo it. An old prophecy said that whoever could untie this knot would rule all of Asia. Many great men had tried for years, pulling and struggling, and all had failed. Alexander looked at the knot for a moment. Then he simply drew his sword and cut straight through it. The problem that had defeated everyone for generations, he solved in one bold second. That was exactly how his mind worked. Then came the great battles against Darius and his massive army. Again and again, Alexander was outnumbered, sometimes badly. And again, he won. He was not just brave, he was brilliant. He always found the weak point. He always struck faster than his enemy expected, and he always led his men from the very front, riding into the danger himself. At the final great battle, the mighty King Darius lost his nerve and fled the field, abandoning his own army. Later, Darius was killed not by Alexander, but by his own men who betrayed him. And just like that, the greatest empire on earth belonged to Alexander. His power was now almost beyond imagination. He marched into Egypt, where the people welcomed him as a liberator and treated him as a living god, a pharaoh. There, he founded a great new city by the sea and gave it his own name, Alexandria. In fact, he founded many cities across his empire and named them all Alexandria, planting his name across the whole known world like seeds. But Alexander was not satisfied. He kept pushing east, further and further, into lands the Greeks had only heard about in legends. He marched all the way to India, fighting fierce armies and even war elephants, and still he won. He wanted to go on. He wanted to reach the very edge of the world. But his soldiers had finally had enough. They had marched for years, thousands of miles from home. They were exhausted, far from their families, and they were afraid. For the first time, his loyal men refused to follow him forward. Alexander was furious. He shut himself away in anger for days. But in the end, even the great conqueror could not fight without his army, and he was forced to turn back. There is a famous legend about Alexander, one that captures his whole soul. They say that when he looked at how much of the world he had conquered, he did not feel joy. Instead, he wept. He wept because he believed there were no more worlds left to conquer. Whether the story is exactly true or not, it tells us something real about him. For Alexander, no amount of glory was ever enough. There was always a hunger that nothing could fill, and it was that endless hunger that brought him, at last, back to the great city of Babylon. He was still a young man, only 32 years old, the master of a vast empire, planning his next great campaign. And then, after a long night of feasting and drinking, he fell ill. A fever took hold of him. Day by day, he grew weaker. The man who had never lost a battle, who had conquered the most powerful empire on earth, now lay in bed, unable to rise. And within just a few days, Alexander the Great was dead. To this day, no one knows for certain what killed him. Some say it was a disease, a fever caught in the marshes near Babylon. Others have always whispered a darker word, poison. Whether it was illness or murder, the result was the same. The greatest conqueror in history was gone, in the prime of his life, with his work unfinished. And here is the most tragic part of all. When his commanders gathered around his bed and asked him who should rule his enormous empire, Alexander, with his last breaths, is said to have given only one answer. To the strongest, he named no clear heir. He left the most powerful empire on earth with no one to hold it together. And so, the moment he died, his most trusted generals turned on each other. They tore his empire apart in long and bloody wars, each one fighting to grab a piece for himself. His own family, his mother, his wife, his young son, were all murdered in the chaos that followed. The empire that Alexander had spent his whole life building fell apart in just a few years. So what do we learn from the dark story of Alexander the Great? We see a man who could conquer anything in the world except his own hunger for more. He won every battle, but in the end he could not control what came after him. He built an empire that did not survive him, yet his name survived for over 2,000 years, all the way to you, right now. He proved that a single person, with enough belief and enough will, can change the entire world. And he also proved that no power on earth, no matter how great, can save you from the one enemy that comes for everyone. Thank you for listening and for learning English with me today. I hope this story was clear and easy to follow. If you enjoyed it, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I love to read your messages. And if you want more true stories, told slowly in simple English, then stay with me, because history is full of dark and powerful tales, and together we are only just beginning. This is a story about time and about a man who almost wasted his whole life before he understood its value. It is a simple story, but it may be one of the most important you will ever hear. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the story called Don't Waste Your Life. There was once a man who lived a normal life. He was not rich, and he was not poor. He had a small house, a steady job, and a quiet routine. Every morning he woke up tired. Every day he did his work. Every night he sat in front of his screen until it was time to sleep. And the next day he did it all again. From the outside, his life looked fine, but inside, the man felt empty. He had a strange and heavy feeling that his real life had not started yet. He was always waiting for it to begin. The man had many dreams. When he was young, he wanted to travel and see the world. He wanted to learn to paint. He wanted to start his own small business. He wanted to call his old friend, the one he had lost contact with. And there was a woman he cared about deeply, but he had never found the courage to tell her how he truly felt. He thought about all of these things often, but every time he said the same simple word to himself: tomorrow, one day, not now, but soon. I will do it when I have more time. I will do it when I have more money. I will do it when the moment is right. And so the man waited. He told himself the trip could wait one more year. The painting could wait until the weekend. The phone call could wait until he was less busy. The business could wait until he felt ready. And telling the woman how he felt, well, that was frightening. So that could wait the longest of all. Every dream was always just a little bit later. Always tomorrow. Never today. But here is the quiet, terrible truth about tomorrow. Tomorrow is a thief. It steals your days, one by one, so slowly and so gently that you never feel it happening. The man was busy, so he did not notice the weeks turning into months. He was tired, so he did not notice the months turning into years. The seasons changed outside his window. His hair slowly turned gray. The friend he meant to call moved to another country. The woman he loved met someone else and married him. And still, the man kept waiting for the right moment to begin his real life. One cold evening, the man was walking home alone. He felt older than he expected to feel, and more empty than he could explain. In a small, quiet park, he saw a very old man sitting alone on a wooden bench, looking up at the stars. Something about the old man's peaceful face made our tired man stop. He sat down on the other end of the bench. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then the old man said softly, without turning his head, "You have the face of someone who is waiting for his life to begin." The man was surprised. He did not know what to say. So the old man continued, in a slow and gentle voice, "I am very old now," he said. "I have seen many things, and I have known many people at the very end of their lives. And I will tell you something that almost no one understands, until it is far too late. At the end, no one wishes they had worked more. No one wishes they had spent more nights in front of a screen, or worried more about small things, or waited more patiently for the perfect moment. That is never the regret." The man listened, and the old man went on. "Do you know what people truly regret? At the very end, they regret the trip they never took. They regret the words they never said. They regret the love they never showed, the dreams they kept putting off, the chances they let pass while they were busy waiting. They do not cry for the things they did. They cry for the things they were always going to do tomorrow." And then the old man turned and looked straight into our man's eyes, and he asked one simple question: "How many tomorrows do you really think you have left?" The man could not answer. And in that silent moment, something inside him finally woke up. He suddenly saw his whole life clearly, like a long road behind him, full of doors he had never opened, full of beautiful things he had walked past while staring at the ground. He had not lived a bad life, but he had not truly lived it at all. He had only been waiting. And he understood, with a cold shock, that no one had promised him an endless supply of tomorrows. When he looked up to thank the old man, the bench was empty. The old man was gone. That night, the man did not sleep. But for the first time in many years, it was not a tired and empty kind of awake. It was alive. His mind was racing, not with worry, but with a single burning thought. Enough. No more waiting. No more tomorrow. And so, that very week, the man began. He did not change everything at once. He simply stopped postponing his own life. He bought a cheap notebook and started to draw. Badly at first, and then a little better. And it made him happy in a way he had forgotten was possible. He found his old friend's number and made the phone call he had been avoiding for 10 years, and they laughed until they cried. He started planning a real trip, a small one, but a real one, to a place he had always dreamed of seeing. He began, slowly, to build the little business he had imagined for so long. He started saying yes to life instead of saying tomorrow, and the man learned something that changed everything. He learned that the perfect moment he had been waiting for his whole life had never existed. It was never going to come. There would always be a reason to wait, always more money to earn, always a safer time just ahead. The only moment he would ever truly have was this one, right now. And the people who live full and happy lives are not the people who waited for the perfect time. They are the people who began before they felt ready, and who chose to truly live the ordinary day in front of them. So, what do we learn from this simple story? Your life is not the years that you have. Your life is the moments that you actually live inside those years. A day spent waiting is a day that is gone forever. And the saddest words in any language are not, "I failed." The saddest words are, "I was always going to." So do not wait for tomorrow to begin your real life, because tomorrow is not promised to anyone. Make the call. Take the trip. Start the dream. Say the words while you still can. Do not waste your life. Thank you for listening and for learning English with me today. I hope this story was clear and that it stays with you a little while after it ends. If it touched you, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell me one thing you will stop putting off. I love to read your messages. And if you want more stories like this one, told slowly in simple English, then stay with me, because we are only just beginning, and there is no better moment to start than right now.
He was the most powerful man in the world, and the men who killed him were his own friends. This is the true story of Julius Caesar. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the story of Julius Caesar. He was born in the city of Rome, around the year 100 before Christ. His family was noble and very old, but it was not rich, and it was not powerful. The Caesars were an ancient family with a proud name, but by the time young Julius was born, other families had far more money and far more influence. So Julius Caesar was born with a great name, but he would have to build his own power with his own hands. Rome in those days was not an empire ruled by one man. It was a republic. That means the city was governed by elected leaders and by a group of powerful men called the Senate. The Senate met to make laws and to guide the state. For hundreds of years, the Romans had been proud of this system. They had no king, and they did not want a king. In fact, the Romans hated the very idea of a king. Long ago, they had thrown out their last king, and they had promised themselves that never again would one man rule them all. Remember this. It is very important for our story. As a young man, Caesar was ambitious, clever, and brave. He was tall and pale with sharp, dark eyes. He cared greatly about how he looked and how he spoke. He was a wonderful speaker, and when he stood up to talk, people listened. But behind the charm, there was a burning desire. Caesar wanted to be the greatest man in Rome. He did not want to be just one leader among many. He wanted to rise above them all. When Caesar was still young, Rome was a dangerous place. There were civil wars and cruel leaders who killed their enemies without mercy. One such leader, a powerful general, decided that young Caesar was a threat and ordered him to obey. Caesar refused, and he had to run and hide to save his life. Friends spoke for him, and in the end he was spared. But even then, people could see that this young man had no fear, and that he would never simply bow his head. To build his career, Caesar needed two things. He needed the love of the ordinary people, and he needed money. He won the love of the people by giving them games, festivals, and grand public shows. He borrowed enormous amounts of money to pay for them, until he was deeply in debt. It was a huge gamble, but Caesar understood something simple and powerful. If the common people loved you, you had a weapon stronger than gold. Step by step he climbed. He held one public office after another, each one higher than the last. And to reach the very top, he made a secret agreement with two other powerful men. One was Pompey, a brilliant and famous general, loved for his victories. The other was Crassus, said to be the richest man in all of Rome. Together, these three men made a private deal to share power among themselves and to help one another. Historians call this arrangement the First Triumvirate, which simply means the rule of three men. To make the bond even stronger, Pompey married Caesar's daughter. With the support of these allies, Caesar was given command of a great army in the north, in a wild and unconquered land the Romans called Gaul. Gaul covered much of what we now call France, Belgium, and the lands around them. It was a land of forests, rivers, and fierce tribes, and it was here, far from Rome, that Julius Caesar would become a legend. For about 8 years, Caesar led his soldiers in the conquest of Gaul. These were the famous Gallic Wars. He fought battle after battle against the tribes of the region. He was a brilliant general, quick to act and full of clever plans. His soldiers adored him because he shared their hardships. He marched with them, he ate with them, and he knew many of them by name. He even sailed across the sea to the mysterious island of Britain, a place most Romans had only imagined. The greatest test came near the end. A young and brave leader of the Gauls named Vercingetorix united many tribes against the Romans. It was the largest rebellion Caesar had ever faced. The two armies met at a hilltop town called Alesia. There, Caesar did something extraordinary. He built a huge wall of wood and earth all around the town to trap his enemy inside. Then, when a second Gallic army came to attack him from behind, he built a second wall facing outward. His men were caught between two enemies, but they held. In the end, Caesar won, and the great rebellion was crushed. The conquest of Gaul was complete. Caesar wrote about these wars himself in a clear and simple style, and his books are still read today. Through them, all of Rome learned of his victories. He had become the most successful general of his age. He had a loyal, battle-hardened army, and he had glory. But he also had powerful enemies at home who watched his rise with fear. While Caesar was away, things had changed. Crassus, the rich third partner, had died in a distant war, and Pompey, once Caesar's friend and ally, had slowly turned against him. Caesar's daughter, the wife of Pompey, had also died, and so the family bond between the two men was broken. Now Pompey stood with the Senate, and the Senate feared Caesar. They saw a man with too much fame, too much money, and too loyal an army. So the Senate gave Caesar an order. "Give up your army," they said, "and come back to Rome alone as an ordinary citizen." Caesar knew what this meant. Without his soldiers, he would be helpless. His enemies would put him on trial and destroy him. He faced a terrible choice. He could obey and lose everything, or he could refuse, march on Rome itself, and begin a civil war. In the north, a small river marked the border of his command. It was called the Rubicon. By law, no general was allowed to bring his army across that river toward Rome. To cross it with soldiers was an act of war against the state itself. Caesar stood at the edge of the Rubicon and thought long and hard, and then he made his decision. He led his army across the water. As he crossed, it is said that he spoke 3 famous words. "The die is cast." In other words, the dice have been thrown, the risk is taken, and there is no going back now. The moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome was at war with itself. Pompey and many senators fled the city, for they were not ready to fight him. Caesar marched south and took control of Rome. Then he chased his enemies across the sea. The 2 great generals, once friends, now hunted each other across the whole Roman world. The final, decisive battle was fought in Greece, at a place called Pharsalus. There, though Pompey had more men, Caesar's veterans won a complete victory. Pompey fled the field. Pompey sailed to Egypt, hoping to find safety there. But the rulers of Egypt wanted to please the winner. When Pompey stepped onto the shore, he was murdered by men who hoped to earn Caesar's favor. When Caesar arrived and was shown the head of his old rival, the stories say he did not smile. He wept. Pompey had once been his friend and his son-in-law, and this was a cruel and shameful end. In Egypt, Caesar met one of the most famous women in all of history. Her name was Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt. She was fighting her own brother for the throne. Clever, charming, and highly educated, Cleopatra formed an alliance with Caesar, and the 2 became lovers. With Caesar's help, she won her war and became the sole ruler of Egypt. Later, she would even travel to Rome to be near him, and she gave birth to a son she said was his. Caesar was now, without question, the master of the Roman world. He had defeated every rival. He returned to Rome in triumph, and the people welcomed him as a hero. And now, with all his power, he began to change the way Rome was governed. The Senate named him dictator. In ancient Rome, a dictator was a leader given total power for a short time during an emergency. But Caesar was not made dictator for a short time. In the end, he was made dictator for life. Caesar used his power to do many things, and some of them were wise and good. He gave land and work to poor citizens and to his old soldiers. He reduced the debts that were crushing ordinary people. He gave Roman citizenship to people in distant lands. He planned great public buildings, and he reformed the calendar. The old Roman calendar was a mess, out of step with the seasons. Caesar created a new one based on the sun, with 365 days and an extra day every 4 years. This calendar was so good that we still use a version of it today. The month of July is even named in his honor. But all this power came at a price. To many Romans, Caesar no longer looked like the leader of a free republic. He looked like a king. And remember, the Romans hated kings. Statues of him were raised. His image appeared on coins, something never done for a living Roman before. He wore special robes and sat on a special chair. Some of his supporters even offered him a crown in public. Caesar pushed the crown away, but many people were not sure he truly meant it. Fear spread among the proud men of the Senate. They began to whisper that Caesar wanted to make himself king and to destroy the republic forever. And so a group of senators formed a secret conspiracy to kill him. There were many of them, perhaps 60 in all. Some were old enemies, but others were men Caesar had trusted, forgiven, and treated as friends. Among them were 2 men in particular. One was named Cassius, a sharp and determined man who hated Caesar's power. The other was named Brutus. And Brutus was special because Caesar loved him almost like a son. Brutus came from a family that had once helped throw out the last king of Rome long ago. The conspirators told Brutus that he had a duty to his ancestors and to Rome to stop Caesar from becoming a king. In the end, painfully, Brutus agreed to join them. There were warnings. It is said that a fortune-teller warned Caesar to beware a certain day in the middle of March, a day the Romans called the Ides of March. Caesar's own wife had a terrible dream and begged him not to go out, but Caesar was proud and he did not want to look afraid. On that morning, the 15th day of March, in the year 44 before Christ, he went to a meeting of the Senate. As he walked, he passed the fortune teller, and he said with a small smile that the day had come and nothing had happened. The old man answered quietly that the day had come, but it was not yet over. Inside the meeting hall, the conspirators were waiting. They gathered around Caesar, pretending to ask him for a favor. Then, at a signal, they drew hidden blades from beneath their robes. Caesar tried to defend himself, but there were far too many of them, and they came from every side. He was struck again and again. The most powerful man in the world fell to the floor at the foot of a statue, the statue of his old rival Pompey. The most famous part of the story comes at the very end. As Caesar looked up, badly wounded, he is said to have seen Brutus among the attackers, Brutus whom he had loved and trusted. And with his last strength, according to the legend, he spoke to him. "And you, Brutus." Then Caesar covered his face with his robe so that no one would watch him die, and he fell silent forever. He was about 55 years old. The men who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic. They thought that with Caesar gone, Rome would be free again and things would return to the old ways. But they were completely wrong. The people of Rome did not thank them. The people were angry and they wept for Caesar. His death did not save the Republic. Instead, it began a new and terrible round of civil wars. In the end, it was Caesar's adopted son and heir, a young man named Octavian, who would win those wars. He would defeat the killers of Caesar, and later he would defeat his last rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. And then Octavian would take a new name. He would become known as Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome. The republic that the conspirators had tried to save was gone forever. The age of the emperors had begun, and it had begun because of Caesar. So what are we left with when we think of Julius Caesar? He was a brilliant general and a gifted writer. He was generous to the poor and merciful to his enemies, and yet he was also ambitious beyond all measure. He gave the world a calendar and a name that would echo for 2,000 years. Long after his death, rulers in distant lands would call themselves by versions of his name, hoping to borrow a little of his greatness. He rose higher than any Roman before him, and that, in the end, was the very thing that destroyed him. He reached for a power so great that the men around him grew afraid, and that fear turned the hands of his own friends against him. Thank you for listening, and for learning English with the story of Julius Caesar. If this story interested you, remember the man behind the legend, the boy from an old Roman family who reached for the whole world. Practice these words, listen again if you like, and we will see you in the next story. She became the most hated woman in France, and the most famous thing she ever said, she never actually said at all. This is the true story of Marie Antoinette. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the dark and tragic story of the last queen of France. She was not born French. She was born in Vienna in Austria in the year 1755. Her name then was Maria Antonia. Her mother was Maria Theresa, the powerful Empress of Austria who had many children and used them all for one purpose. Her children were not only sons and daughters, they were tools of politics. They would marry the royal families of Europe, and in this way Austria would grow strong. Maria Antonia was a pretty, lively, and not very serious girl. She loved music and dancing. She did not love her books, and she was not a strong student, but her future had already been decided for her. To make peace between Austria and France, two old enemies, she would be sent to France. She would marry the boy who would one day be king. So in the year 1770, when she was only 14 years old, she left her home and her family forever. She traveled to France. At the border, in a strange and cold ceremony, she had to give up everything Austrian. Her clothes, her servants, even her little dog were taken from her. She walked into a tent as an Austrian girl, and she walked out the other side as a French princess. She was 14, alone and far from home. The boy she married was named Louis Auguste. He was only 15. He was shy, quiet, and awkward. He loved hunting and making locks with his own hands, but he did not enjoy parties, and he did not enjoy people. The young couple were very different, and at the beginning they were like two nervous children, strangers in a giant golden palace. That palace was Versailles, and Versailles was like nothing else in the world. It was the home of the French kings, a place of unbelievable wealth and beauty, with hundreds of rooms, mirrors, gardens, and fountains. But Versailles was also a kind of prison. Life there followed strict and ancient rules. Every moment of the day was a public ceremony. The princess could not even get dressed in private. Each morning, a crowd of noble ladies watched her, and each one had the right to help, passing her clothes to her one piece at a time. For a young girl who loved freedom, this golden world was beautiful and suffocating at the same time. In 1774, the old king died. And so, at only 19 and 18 years old, Louis and Marie Antoinette suddenly became the king and queen of France. They were so young. When they heard the news, it is said that they fell to their knees and cried, "We are too young to rule. God, guide us and protect us." They were right to be afraid. At first, the people of France loved their beautiful young queen, but Marie Antoinette did not understand the danger she was in. She was lonely, and she was bored, and she began to spend money. She loved fashion, and her hair was built up into towers, decorated with feathers and ribbons and even little ships. She loved jewels and beautiful dresses. She loved to gamble at cards late into the night. And she built herself a private escape, a small and charming place near the palace called the Petit Trianon, where she could be away from the crowds and the rules. To Marie Antoinette, this was simply how a queen lived. But outside the palace walls, France was changing. The country was deep in debt. The harvests were bad. Bread, the most basic food, was becoming too expensive for ordinary people to buy. The people were hungry. And when hungry people looked at their queen with her diamonds and her towering hair and her private palace, their love turned slowly into anger. They gave her a cruel new name. They called her Madame Deficit, the woman who was spending France into ruin. And here we come to the most famous story of all. The story says that when Marie Antoinette was told that the people had no bread to eat, she answered coldly, "Then let them eat cake." It is one of the most famous sentences in all of history. It is the perfect image of a queen who did not care. But here is the truth. There is no real evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said these words. The phrase appears in a book written by the philosopher Rousseau, and he was writing about an unnamed princess years earlier when Marie Antoinette was just a small child in Austria. The words were almost certainly never hers, but it did not matter. The people believed it. And sometimes, a story that people believe becomes stronger than the truth. The legend of the heartless queen had been born, and it would help to destroy her. Then came an event that damaged her even more, even though she was completely innocent. It was a strange and complicated crime known as the affair of the diamond necklace. A group of clever thieves used the queen's name to steal an enormously expensive diamond necklace. Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with it. She did not even want the necklace. But by the time the truth came out, the damage was done. The public was sure that their greedy queen had secretly bought the necklace while the people starved. Every scandal, true or false, now stuck to her. In 1789, the anger of France finally exploded. It became the French Revolution. In Paris, crowds attacked the Bastille, the great prison that stood as a symbol of the king's power. The old world was breaking apart. And in October of that year, a huge crowd, many of them poor and hungry women, marched all the way from Paris to Versailles. They came for the king and queen. They surrounded the palace. By the end, the royal family was forced to leave their golden home and travel to Paris, where they would live as prisoners in everything but name. For 2 years, the family was watched and controlled. In 1791, they tried to escape. In the middle of the night, in disguise, they slipped out of the city and rode east, hoping to reach loyal soldiers near the border. But they were recognized along the way. A town called Varennes, they were stopped and arrested and brought back to Paris in shame. After that, almost no one trusted them. The king and queen were now seen as traitors to France. The revolution grew darker and more violent. The monarchy was abolished. In 1793, the king, Louis XVI, was put on trial and executed. The blade of the guillotine ended his life, and Marie Antoinette became a widow and a prisoner, separated from her children, waiting alone in a cold cell for whatever would come next. Her own trial came soon after. It was not a fair trial. The result had already been decided. She was accused of crimes against France, some of them inventions so cruel and so false that even her enemies were uncomfortable. Through it all, she remained calm and dignified. When she was asked to defend herself against the worst and most disgusting lie, she turned to the mothers in the room and spoke simply about being a mother herself, and even some of her enemies were moved. On the 16th of October, 1793, Marie Antoinette was taken from her cell. Her hair was cut short. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she was placed in an open cart and driven slowly through the streets of Paris, while crowds watched the fallen queen pass by. She was 37 years old. She had been a queen, and now she was led to the same guillotine that had taken her husband. At the very end, as she climbed the steps, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, and her last recorded words were not a curse and not a grand speech. They were a simple apology. "Pardon me, sir," she said. "I did not mean to do it." A moment later, the last queen of France was gone. So what are we left with? For more than 200 years, Marie Antoinette has been remembered as the symbol of a heartless queen, the woman who told the starving people to eat cake. But that woman never really existed. The real Marie Antoinette was a frightened 14-year-old girl, sent alone to a foreign country, married to a stranger, trapped in a golden cage she never chose. She was not a wise queen, and she spent too much money in a time of terrible hunger, but she was not the monster of the legend. She was a human being, caught in a storm of history far larger than herself, and in the end she was destroyed by a story that was never even true. Thank you for listening, and for learning English with the story of Marie Antoinette. If this story moved you, remember the real woman behind the legend. Practice these words, listen again if you like, and we will see you in the next story.
This is the story of Napoleon. He was a small boy from a small island, and he became the master of almost all of Europe. He won battle after battle, and kings were afraid of his name. But he wanted more, always more, and that hunger would destroy him. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the dark story of Napoleon. Napoleon was born more than 200 years ago on a small island in the sea called Corsica. His family was not rich, and they were not powerful. He was not even truly French at first. On his island, people spoke a different language, and the other children would later laugh at the way he spoke. Napoleon was small, he was poor, and he was a foreigner. But inside this little boy there was a fire, and that fire would one day burn the whole world. When he was a young boy, his family sent him far away, to a military school in France. There, the rich French students laughed at him. They laughed at his name. They laughed at his accent. They laughed at his poor family. Napoleon had no money and few friends, so he did the one thing that was his to do. He studied. While the others played, he read books about war, about history, about great leaders of the past. He was quiet, he was serious, and he was always watching. He learned a hard lesson very early. If you are not born with power, you must take it. Then, all across France, the ground began to shake. The people of France rose up against their king. It was a revolution. The old world was breaking apart, and in the chaos, there was blood, fear, and opportunity. For a poor young officer with a brilliant mind, this was the perfect storm. In a time of order, no one would have listened to him. But in a time of chaos, talent could rise like fire. And Napoleon did rise. He was given command of soldiers, and very quickly, everyone could see that this young man was different. He was fast. He was bold. He made decisions in seconds while older generals were still thinking. He cared for his soldiers, and they began to love him. In one famous moment, he stood in the middle of the danger, with cannons firing around him, and he did not run. His men saw it, and a legend began to grow. Soon, France sent him to fight in faraway lands, and there his legend exploded. In Italy, with a small and hungry army, he defeated forces much larger than his own. He moved his men so fast that the enemy never knew where he would appear. He won, and he won, and he won again. The whole of France began to say one name with wonder: Napoleon. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a hero, the man who could not be beaten. But Napoleon wanted more than victories. He wanted power itself. So he came back to France, where the new government was weak and the people were tired of chaos. And with the army behind him, Napoleon took control of the entire country. There was no king now, but there was something just as powerful. There was Napoleon. He told the people he would bring order, glory, and greatness. And many of them believed him, because he gave them exactly that. For a time, it was a golden age. Napoleon was a brilliant ruler, not only a soldier. He built new roads. He built new schools. He created a new system of laws that was so clear and so fair that countries still use parts of it today. He brought order out of chaos. The poor boy from the small island had become the most important man in France. And then, in a grand and golden ceremony, he placed a crown upon his own head. Napoleon was now an emperor. Now all the old kings of Europe were afraid. Who was this man, this commoner, this emperor who came from nothing? They did not want him to exist. So again and again, they joined together and went to war against him. And again, Napoleon crushed them. At a great battle called Austerlitz, he destroyed two mighty empires in a single day. It was perhaps his most perfect victory. He seemed less like a man and more like a force of nature. Most of Europe was now under his control or his command. But here, we must see the danger inside him. Napoleon could not stop. Every victory made him want another. Every crown made him want one more. He placed his brothers and his friends on the thrones of other countries, as if Europe were his own family business. He was no longer fighting to protect France. He was fighting to feed his own endless hunger. And slowly, that hunger began to make him blind. His first great mistake was in the south, in Spain. He thought it would be easy. He put his own brother on the Spanish throne. But the people of Spain did not want a foreign king. They rose up against him, not as a great army, but as thousands of small fighters who attacked and then disappeared. It was a long, ugly, bleeding war that Napoleon could not win and could not end. It quietly drained his strength, year after year. But Napoleon barely looked at it. His eyes were already turning towards something far bigger and far colder. That something was Russia. Russia was vast, and its emperor would no longer obey him. So Napoleon decided to punish it. He gathered the largest army the world had ever seen, hundreds of thousands of men from all across his empire, and he marched east into the enormous, endless land of Russia. It was the greatest army of its time, led by the greatest general of its time. It looked unstoppable. It was, in truth, a march toward death. The Russians did something clever and terrible. They did not stand and fight. They retreated deeper and deeper into their own country. And as they went, they burned everything behind them. They burned the food. They burned the farms. They burned their own villages so that Napoleon's army would find nothing but ash. Napoleon marched all the way to the great city of Moscow, and when he arrived, he found it almost empty. And then the city went up in flames. He had marched into the heart of Russia, and he had won nothing at all. And then came the real enemy, winter. The Russian winter fell upon Napoleon's army like the hand of death. The temperature dropped far below freezing. The soldiers had no food and no shelter. Now Napoleon had to retreat, back across the same burned and frozen land, and it became a nightmare beyond words. Men froze where they walked. They starved. They fell in the snow and never rose again. The largest army in the world melted away into the ice. Of the hundreds of thousands who marched into Russia, only a small, broken few came back. Napoleon's strength was gone. Now the kings of Europe saw their chance. Napoleon was wounded, and they came at him from every side, all together. He still fought brilliantly. He still won battles, but he could not win them all. Not anymore. There were simply too many enemies and too few soldiers. At last they entered France itself. They took his capital city, and they forced the great emperor to give up his throne. They sent him away to a tiny island, far out in the sea, and they told him his story was over. But Napoleon's story was not over yet. In secret, he escaped from the island and returned to France. And what happened next is almost impossible to believe. The soldiers who were sent to arrest him saw his face, heard his voice, and instead of stopping him, they followed him. In a matter of days, without firing a shot, Napoleon took back his entire empire. The whole of Europe trembled. The emperor had returned, but this return would be short. It would last only about 100 days. All of his enemies gathered their armies for one final battle, near a place whose name the world would never forget, Waterloo. There, on a single rain-soaked day, Napoleon fought his last fight. It was close, terribly close. But by the end of the day, his army was broken and Napoleon had lost everything forever. The age of Napoleon was over. This time, his enemies took no chances. They sent him to a different island, much smaller and much more lonely, far away in the middle of a great ocean where no one could rescue him. And there, on that distant rock, surrounded by the sea, the man who had once ruled most of Europe lived out his final years as a prisoner. The emperor of the world now had a small house, a few servants, and the endless waves. And there, alone and far from his beloved France, Napoleon grew sick, and slowly the fire inside him went out. He died on that island, a prisoner to the very end. So what do we learn from the dark story of Napoleon? We see a poor boy who was laughed at and who used his mind and his will to conquer almost the entire world. He proved that where you are born does not decide how far you can go. But we also see the other side. His greatest strength, his endless hunger, was also the thing that destroyed him. He could conquer kings and empires, but he could never conquer his own need for more. And in the end, that hunger carried him from a throne above all of Europe to a lonely rock in the middle of the sea. Thank you for listening and for learning English with me today. I hope this story was clear and easy to follow. If you enjoyed it, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I love to read your messages. And if you want more true stories, told slowly in simple English, then stay with me. Because history is full of dark and powerful tales, and together, we are only just beginning.
He could imagine a machine so perfectly in his mind that he never needed to draw it. And yet this genius, who lit up the modern world, died alone in a small hotel room, with almost no money, loved most of all by the pigeons he fed. This is the true story of Nikola Tesla. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the story of Nikola Tesla. He was born on a stormy night. It was the summer of 1856 in a small village called Smiljan in a land that is now part of Croatia. There is an old family story that during his birth, lightning flashed across the sky and the midwife was afraid. She said the storm was a bad sign and that this child would be a child of darkness. But his mother answered softly, "No, he will be a child of light." It is a beautiful story, and for once, the legend turned out to be true. His father was a priest, a serious man who wanted his son to follow him into the church. His mother could not read, but she had a brilliant, inventive mind. She built small tools and machines to help with the work of the house, and she could remember long poems word for word. From her, young Nicola learned that a mind could be a kind of workshop, a place where things are built in silence before they are ever built with the hands. And Nicola's mind was strange and wonderful, even as a boy. He saw pictures in the air. When he thought of an object, a bright and detailed image would appear before his eyes, so real that he sometimes could not tell it apart from the world around him. At first this frightened him, but slowly he learned to control it. He learned to build entire machines inside his imagination, to turn them, to test them, and even to run them, all without touching a single piece of metal. This gift would stay with him for his whole life. As a young man, he studied engineering. He was a brilliant student, but a restless one, working long hours, sometimes barely sleeping. And during these years, one idea began to burn inside him. It was a difficult idea about electricity, about a better way to make it move and to send it across great distances. His teachers told him it was impossible, but Nicola could not let it go. He carried the problem in his mind for years, turning it over and over. Then one day, while walking in a park at sunset, reciting poetry to a friend, the answer came to him all at once. He saw it, complete and perfect, glowing in his imagination. It was the idea of alternating current, a system that could carry electricity far and wide, cheaply and safely. He was so overcome that he could barely speak. He had just imagined a machine that would one day power the entire world. In 1884, Nikola Tesla arrived in America. He was 28 years old. He came with almost nothing in his pockets, only a few coins, some poems, and a letter of introduction. That letter was addressed to the most famous inventor in the world, a man named Thomas Edison. Edison was already a legend. He had given the world the electric light bulb, and he had built the first electric power systems in America. His systems used a kind of electricity called direct current, or DC. Edison hired the young Tesla, and at first the two men worked together, but they were opposites in almost every way. Edison was practical, stubborn, and he trusted only hard experiment, trying one thing after another until something worked. Tesla was elegant, precise, and he trusted the pure power of his own mind. The two men did not stay friends for long. There is a story that Edison promised Tesla a large sum of money to improve his machines. Tesla worked tirelessly and succeeded. But when he asked for the money, Edison only laughed and said it had been a joke, that Tesla did not understand American humor. Whether the story is completely true or not, the meaning is clear. Tesla left, and soon the two greatest minds in electricity would become enemies. This was the beginning of one of the most famous battles in the history of invention. History remembers it as the War of the Currents. On one side stood Edison with his direct current. Direct current was safe enough, but it had a terrible weakness. It could not travel far. To use it, you needed a power station every few streets, an enormous and expensive web of machinery. On the other side stood Tesla with his alternating current, his AC. Alternating current could be sent across huge distances, over hundreds of miles, cheaply and efficiently. It was, quite simply, the better system. Tesla found a powerful partner, a businessman named George Westinghouse, who believed in the young inventor and bought his patents. And now the war began in earnest. Edison did not want to lose. His direct current was his empire, and he fought to protect it. He began a campaign to make people afraid of alternating current. He told the public that Tesla's electricity was deadly, a silent killer waiting in the wires. To prove his point, Edison did some very dark things. His men held public demonstrations in which they used alternating current to kill animals, trying to frighten the crowds. He even worked quietly to make sure that the first electric chair, a new machine for executing prisoners, used alternating current so that people would forever connect Tesla's invention with death. It was a cruel and dishonest campaign, but in the end, it did not work, because the truth was simply too strong. Alternating current was better, and everyone who understood electricity knew it. The great test came in the year 1893 at the World's Fair in Chicago. The whole enormous fair needed to be lit with electric light, more light than had ever been gathered in one place. Westinghouse and Tesla won the contract, and when the switch was thrown, the fair blazed to life, glowing with thousands of lamps, a city of light in the darkness. Millions of people came and saw it, and they understood. The future would be electric, and the electricity would be Tesla's. Soon after came his greatest triumph of all. There is a place called Niagara Falls, one of the most powerful waterfalls in the world, where an ocean of water crashes down every second. For years, people had dreamed of capturing that power and turning it into electricity. And it was Tesla's system, his alternating current, that finally did it. Great machines were built at the falls, and the raw power of the water was turned into clean electric energy. Then that energy was sent along the wires, more than 20 miles away, to light up the city of Buffalo. It was a miracle of the modern age. The wild power of a river had been tamed and sent across the land to serve human beings. Tesla had promised years before that he would harness the falls, and now he had done it. This is the system we still use today. Every time you turn on a light, the electricity that flows to you is the great-grandchild of Nikola Tesla's idea, born in a park at sunset so many years ago. At this moment, Tesla stood at the top of the world. He was famous, admired, and full of ideas that seemed to come from the future. He dreamed of wireless communication, of sending messages through the air without any wires at all. He experimented with radio, with remote control, with strange and beautiful machines that filled his laboratory with lightning. He once built a coil so powerful that it threw bolts of man-made lightning across the room, with a roar like thunder. Visitors said that stepping into his laboratory was like stepping into the mind of a wizard. And now Tesla dreamed his greatest dream of all. He wanted to send not just messages but power itself through the air to the whole world for free. He imagined a world where anyone, anywhere could pull energy out of the sky, the way we breathe air. To build this dream, he began to construct an enormous tower on Long Island near New York. It was called Wardenclyffe. It rose high into the sky, a strange and lonely structure, unlike anything else on Earth. But the dream was too big and the money ran out. His investors began to worry. They asked a hard question. If Tesla gave the world free energy, how would anyone make money from it? Who would pay for electricity that fell freely from the sky? One by one, his backers walked away. The great tower at Wardenclyffe was never finished. It stood silent and empty for years, and at last it was torn down and sold for scrap to pay Tesla's debts. His most beautiful dream had crumbled into dust. And from here, slowly, the story turned sad. Tesla was a genius, but he was not a businessman. Other men grew rich from ideas that were close to his own. He, who had given the world its power, began to lose his own money. He moved from hotel to hotel in New York, often unable to pay his bills, growing poorer and stranger with each passing year. For Tesla was an unusual man in every way. He never married, and he lived almost entirely for his work. He had strange fears and strange habits. He could not bear to touch hair or to see pearls. He counted his steps as he walked, and he needed everything in numbers that could be divided by 3. He ate alone at the same time each evening, following his own private rules. He was a lonely man, wrapped inside the great cathedral of his own mind. And in his final years, he found one strange and gentle comfort. He fell in love with pigeons. Every day he would walk in the parks of New York and feed the birds, and he would care for sick and injured pigeons in his hotel room, nursing them back to health. He spoke of one white pigeon in particular, a bird he said he loved as a man loves a woman. She was, he said, the joy of his life. When she grew old and died, Tesla wept, and he said that on that day, something inside him broke, and he knew that his life's work was finished. On a cold January day in 1943, Nikola Tesla died, alone, in room number 3327 of a New York hotel. He was 86 years old. He had almost no money. The man who had lit the world died in the dark, quietly, with only the pigeons to remember him. But that is not the end of the story. For a long time, the world seemed to forget Nikola Tesla. His old rival Edison was remembered as a hero, while Tesla's name faded into shadow. Yet the truth has a way of returning. Slowly, people began to remember. Engineers, historians, and dreamers looked again at his work, and they understood how much of the modern world he had built. Today, his name is spoken with wonder once more. His alternating current still hums in the walls of every home. The unit that measures the strength of a magnetic field is called the Tesla, in his honor. And around the world, he has become a symbol of the pure and lonely genius, the man who saw too far ahead of his time. So what are we left with? Nikola Tesla could hold entire machines in his mind, spinning and glowing before they existed in the world. He gave us the electricity that powers our lives, and he dreamed of gifts we have still not learned how to accept. He was not a rich man, and he was not a happy man. He was something rarer and stranger. He was a man who lived more in the future than in the present, and who paid a heavy price for seeing so clearly. He died poor and alone, feeding his beloved pigeons in the great, indifferent city. But the light he gave us never went out. It is still shining all around you right now. Thank you for listening and for learning English with the story of Nikola Tesla. If this story moved you, remember the quiet genius behind the light. Practice these words, listen again if you like, and we will see you in the next story.